Welcome to Murray Grove. My name is Carol Haig. I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister, and I love Murray Grove. My husband and I have been involved with it for quite some time, partly because there's such a wonderful story about its beginning. Over 250 years ago, a local farmer named Thomas Potter lived in this area. It was called Good Luck, New Jersey then. Thomas Potter was a good farmer and a good businessman, but he was not educated. And he used to invite people to come and read the Bible to him and talk to him about what was going on in religious circles. He was fascinated by religion. After a while, his wife got a little tired of all his guests filling up her parlor, and she sent Thomas Potter off to figure out a different way. Well, he was a very resourceful man, and he built a chapel. He built his chapel because he'd heard ideas that there might be a different way of looking at God. God as a loving being, rather than the Calvinist kind of harsh God that was common in faith around him at that time. So he built his chapel, and his neighbors kind of laughed at him. They thought it was pretty funny. And lots of people of different religions wanted to use the chapel. They could come and preach in it, and they wanted Thomas Potter to give them his chapel. But he said, no, not until you can prove to me that God believes you are the right religion. So years went by, almost 10 years, and Thomas Potter kept his chapel and still invited people to come and preach. Now, at the same time, across the Atlantic Ocean in England, there was a man named John Murray. John Murray was a very devout Methodist. He and his wife and his children were involved in the Methodist Church, and he was such a good Methodist that he became a preacher. And the Methodist Church one day sent him off to retrieve a couple who had become really involved with something strange called Universalism. They were considered heretics, and they sent John Murray to retrieve them to the true faith. Well, John Murray went and talked to them, and the more he talked, the more he thought, wow, they really have the right idea, because they were convincing him that God was a universalist, that God wanted everyone to go to heaven, not the Calvinist view that only a few would be elect. So John Murray began preaching universalism, and of course his Methodist church sent him packing. They didn't want him. So he was a universalist preacher. After a while, though, diseases hit his family. One of his children got really, really sick and died. His wife got sick and she died. And John Murray had spent every penny he owned trying to make his family healthy. That time in England, if you didn't have money, you were put in debtor's prison. So John Murray was put in debtor's prison until a relative of his found out that he could be released from prison if he would promise to leave England and never come back. So John Murray got on a ship called the Hand in Hand, and he sailed across the Atlantic Ocean. By now, it was about 1770, and there was still no United States, but there were a lot of confusion in the colonies, and they were opposing the British rule. And as their little ship, the Hand in Hand, neared the port of New York, they got message from outbound ships that the port was closed. And so the Hand in Hand sailed south along the American coast until it got to Philadelphia. And there they deposited all their supplies and most of the passengers. But just then the captain learned that the New York port was now open. And so John Murray and some other passengers got back on the Hand in Hand, and they started sailing north along the Atlantic coast. But a big storm came up, and the storm blew the ship onto a sandbar, and it was lodged there, and they couldn't get off. So the captain, knowing that John Murray was a pretty positive and competent guy, sent him inshore with some of the sailors to get provisions. And John Murray, in a small boat, landed in the shore, and it was in a little area called Good Luck, New Jersey. And he asked where could he get provisions. Well, the people there knew Thomas Potter, and they said, go down the road to Thomas Potter's place. I'm sure you can get food from him. So John Murray walked down the road, and he saw Thomas Potter sitting outside his house. What he didn't know was that Thomas Potter, sitting there, had looked out across the fields and seen the ship stuck on the sandbar. And Thomas Potter was convinced that his preacher had come. So John Murray went there and he talked to him, and he saw a big bowl of fish next to Thomas Potter. And he said, Matt, would you sell me some of your fish? I need to feed these sailors while we're stuck on the sandbar. And Thomas Potter said, no, I won't sell you the fish. John Murray was taken aback, but Thomas Potter said, no, I will give you the fish. They come free from God through the ocean to me, and I will give them to you. But I want you to come and talk with me. So John Murray went off with the fish and his sailors, and he got them settled in a local bar. And then he came back and went to Thomas Potter's house. Thomas Potter greeted him and said, oh, I've been waiting for you for so long. But John Murray said, I was only here a few hours ago. But Thomas Potter said, welcome. I want to talk to you about your faith. And the two men talked and talked about religion. And Thomas Potter finally wheedled it out of John Murray that he had been a Universalist preacher. But John Murray said, no, I've left all of that behind. My life in England was terrible. My wife died. My child died. I went to prison. I don't want to have anything to do with Universalist preaching ever again. I'm starting a new life in the new world. But Thomas Potter was insistent, and he talked to him and talked to him, and finally convinced John Murray that if the wind didn't change and the hand in hand was released from the was not released from the sandbar, that John Murray would preach in his chapel. So John Murray agreed, and he prayed the next several days that the wind would change and his ship would sail and he wouldn't have to preach. But the wind stayed firm, and the hand in hand was stuck on the sandbar. And sure enough, 3 or 4 days had passed, and it was going to be Sunday, and he would preach in the chapel. So Thomas Potter sent his riders out all over the place to collect the friends and neighbors who he had told about having a preacher come to preach universal salvation. And John Murray kept his word, and he went to the chapel on Sunday morning, and he preached. And he preached, and he preached. In those days, sermons might have been 3 hours long. And he preached universal love, that God was love and that everyone would go to heaven. And the more he preached, the more he recovered his faith. And he became his Universalist self. And he preached, and finally the sermon came to an end. And just then, one of the sailors ran up and said, the wind has changed. The ship is going to be released from the sandbar. And so John Murray said goodbye to Thomas Potter and went off into his ship. But the two men had become good friends, and they became friends, and John Murray, although he moved with the ship into New York and then on up to New England, and he became the founder of the first Universalist church in Gloucester, Massachusetts. But he and Thomas Potter would visit, and John Murray came back and visited with Thomas Potter here in the farm. And eventually, in his will, Thomas Potter left his chapel to John Murray. And we honor that chapel and that heritage here at Murray Grove all the time. End of story.